This is the first of this series of lectures on the history of typography and letterforms, and I thought it would be a good idea to say something about myself, who I am, and some of what I've done. This is an exercise in seeing if I can replace the narrative for any single slide. I'm doing it with this one because it's a publication that, as you see, was brought out in September of 2019 in the journal of the association called Letter Exchange. In fact, it was based on a talk I did in Italy, in Parma, at the so-called Bodoni Museum, which I gave in Italian. And perhaps I should say that when we come to Baskerville and Bodoni, I shall be doing my talk in English. This book is the work of someone I'll be mentioning quite often in this series of lectures, because Harry Carter was certainly one of the major 20th century authorities on printing with type. And in fact, type was something that he could actually make himself. He had cut punches, made matrices, and cast real type. This is a book that was produced at the time of an exhibition that was mounted at the Soane Museum in London, dealing with the history of the sans serif, a subject that I'd made a study of, and for which it seemed to me John Soane, the architect, was responsible for reviving and bringing back into current usage. And this is a blog that I set up in 2006 and carried on for quite a few numbers. In this particular case, you've got a kind of supplement to that book I've just shown you, because we were able to show things that we found in the course of setting up the exhibition, but had been no time to get into the book. I'm going to continue with this publication of my collected essays, only 3 of them, but here they are, which was kindly put into Italian and designed by my friend Giovanni Russo in Rome. And one of them, La ninfa e la grotta, la rinascita dei caratteri senza grazie, is the translation of my piece on the sans serif that we've just been looking at. But it seemed to me it would be helpful just to glance at least at 1 or 2 historical books that may be useful. In a way, Daniel Berkeley Updike's printing types is a bit absurd. I mean, as you see, it's published in 1937, but that was its 2nd edition. It's well over 100 years old in its origin. And it's, I think, pretty uneven in its qualities. If you can stand his style, which I find rather heavy and sometimes jokey, it has some very, very well-chosen illustrations. And it's been reprinted so many times that it's pretty easy to find in its printed form. So there we are. As for more recent works, this quite thin book by Stan Knight, which, as you see, is relatively recent, has some very useful material in it. It's very up to date. He's read a great deal. He's an expert on writing as well as type, and has already done a very useful book on styles of writing. But here is the one he did in 2012. And I'm afraid you get a rather exaggerated idea of the glamour of this image, which was made for him in an English library in colour. The book is completely black and white, monochrome. But if you stay with this course, you'll get a glimpse of that image, because he gave me a version of it, which you'll find in one of my slides. I'm going to move on to this one, which is a vast, heavy book, simply because it's one of the most recent historical works I know, and I mean it comes right into the whole period of digital typography, but it's got a backup of historical material, which is not half bad. So there it is. But it's, as you see, it's a hefty book. The one I would recommend in connection with this course is by Henrik Vervliet. On another occasion I'll say a bit more about him. He's very much the grand old man of type history. But this book of 2010, which it's quicker to call Conspectus, is extraordinarily useful because it really is a catalogue of the work of the big French type makers of the 16th century, Claude Guéramont, Robert Grandjean, and then Autain, Guillot. These are all big names, but it's quite useful to have a way of actually picking out particular examples. And here is, from one of his pages, an example of the sort of thing that only he could have provided. He was, for a while, the deputy director of the Plantin-Moretus Museum, and was one of a team that identified and a lot of the material there, including original matrices. And here is type cast from the original 16th century matrices of a type of Robert Grandjean, all very splendid. And I suppose it enables me to introduce the name of Matthew Carter, son of Harry, because Matthew was one of the team that sorted material in Antwerp at the Plantin-Moretus Museum, and then went on to become a type designer in his own right. If you want to know where he said what I've put here, I don't think of myself as an artist, you won't find it written, because as I note here, it's a radio interview, very good one too, which is archived, and I'm sure you can find it if you search for it. Well, we shall be coming across the name of Matthew as well as Harry in this course. If he says that he's not an artist, some people might not really agree with him. This is a drawing when he was working on the type called Galliard, based on the work of Grandjean. I think it's pretty good. Another of my own productions in, as you see, 2002, was I was involved in an exhibition to mark the 300 years since a big book was produced in Paris, showing the medals of Louis XIV. And for it, famously, a type was made, which was called the King's Roman, Le Roman du Roi. And we shall be seeing more of this later in the course. If I say a type was made for it, I mean that it was, and I will show you examples. Here's my version of it, and I suppose I better admit that, encouraged by my friend Justin Howes, I produced a number of historical types. And here is one of them. This is the Roman du Roi. There's a slightly larger detail of it. And I suppose since this is a kind of great national French type, I ought to admit that I had a go at making a German type. This, which I think is a very good German Gothic, Fraktur, is a type that was revived casting in old mattresses in the 20th century, and it wasn't that difficult to lift it off the specimen of the founder who had these mattresses and have a go at making a Fraktur, because I thought on the whole that the digital Frakturs that were available were really pretty weak and miserable. I think this is better, and just to give you an idea of what it looks like seriously, that is a letter from Mrs. Goethe, the mother of the famous German poet and genius, who didn't like this new habit of printing everything in Roman type. And so she says, Im Übrigen bitte ich, bleibe Deutsch, auch in den Buchstaben. Do please stay German in your type. I don't think he did. As for making type, I'll give this some attention because it's not easy to find examples of the technology. And this is one that, as you see, was actually photographed in the Bodoni Museum. My friend Stan Nelson and I persuaded the museum to let us cast a type of Bodoni's. That's Bodoni's own type mould here, and that's one of his mattresses. The ladle on the left is a very pretty one, made by Stan. We'll come to him in a moment. I'm showing this mainly because it's one of the more, I think, pretty images I've made. The original bunches made for Baskerville, he wasn't a type cutter, by the way. They are all in the University Library at Cambridge, and I was allowed to make these photographs. I say allowed because I didn't sign away my copyright. So it's my picture. They're not easy to photograph and get the reflection of light to give you an idea of the form of the punch. I think this one worked on the whole quite well. Here's Baskerville, the way he wanted the world to see him. This is when he was a manufacturer in Birmingham who'd made enough money to turn to his great passion, which was typography, and he had these types made for him. This is a very, very rare specimen indeed. I think there are only 2 copies known, and this is one I was able to get for the St. Bride Library, which is where you can find it. As for another side of type making, there are really only 2 books about how to make punches and produce type from them. And it's by Fournier. We'll come to him later in the course. And he wrote a manuel typographique, a handbook of type making, which is totally in French. You can find it online, by the way. It's a very rare book and a very expensive one, but there's a good version online. If you want the English version, there's an excellent one by, guess who, Harry Carter. And as in 1995, with a German friend, we produced a facsimile of the French text, and then reprinted Harry Carter's translation, which he did in 1930, but which is a rather rare book. And so here is this, I think, excellent translation. I mentioned that he made his own type. Well, that helped in translating someone else's account of how to do it. Some of the other things I'll be showing in this course you won't ever have seen before, I think. This has never been published. It's a specimen of a very important Dutch punch cutter of the 17th century, Christoffel van Dijck. Justin Howes, whose name I put here, found it by going through the catalogue of the National Archives in Kew. And here it is. As I say, it's never been published to my knowledge. And its interest is that it shows, for example, this particular type, a very, very fine one that he made, and which was remade by the English monotype people in a type which is indeed called Van Dijck. But here you've got an image that I made at the National Archive. I hope you like it. As for modern people making type, the outstanding example is Madame Gable, Nelly Gable, who has just retired from her position as punch cutter and general person in charge of all the typographical materials of the Imprimerie Nationale in France. Here she was when the Imprimerie Nationale was still based in the middle of Paris, from which it has now moved. And here she is literally at work, working on the engraving of a punch from this video. And I'm not too sure whether that is still available, but it's well worth looking at. And she worked to make a book, which she wrote herself, of her experience in punch cutting, that was published in 2019. And she did it with her assistant, Annie Bossel, who, as you see, is a skilled draftsperson. And their book was published in French, which is what she wrote it in. And if you want an English version, I did one, and you can buy that too. I mentioned Stan Nelson. This is a video, but it's only a single frame from it. If you want it, it's not that difficult. Put his name and Atelier Press into YouTube, and you'll get a number of clips which I think are excellently done and show the making of type. Punches, matrices, casting, you name it. As for some of my own work, I'm throwing this in because there's the mould for making type. It's an account from a French handbook never published, of the early 18th century, and it's in this Journal of the Printing Historical Society. I've shown you types I've made, and I'll just show one or two more to show the sort of thing that does interest me. Here's an ABC, which was clearly given to a child at the beginning of the 19th century. And it's a type that I find rather nice, rather vulgar, rather gutsy. It sort of makes its point quite powerfully. Not very well printed, but wouldn't it be nice to have it? Well, it's there in a type founder's specimen, which luckily gives us the every figure too, by the way. The ABC just gave us the letters of the alphabet. And so with all this, I was able to make a type or a font that I simply called Fat, because Fat Faces is its name to a 19th century printer, a boldface, we would say. And once again, the name of Giovanni Lusu crops up. This was a little book about the cover designs he made for the Italian paper L'Unità. And as you see, the text font, which you see just a few words of, was one I also made, my New Scotch. Another thing that looks like type but isn't was this handbook of alphabets of the late 18th century, which I did publish in an article I wrote. And when it came to finding an alphabet for Tate Britain, it seemed a good model to follow. So if you look at the street frontage of Tate Britain, here is an alphabet based on the one I've just shown you, adapted by John Morgan, very intelligently, I think. This is a relief letter, which I think gives it a bit more robustness, pinned to a Portland stone entrance pillar. And this takes me to the most, I think, interesting job I've had in the last few years. Victory, amazingly, is this ship launched, if you believe, in 1765, which is still around at Portsmouth. And then in 1805, so kind of not exactly young even then, took part in the Battle of Trafalgar. And it's been preserved lovingly at Portsmouth, where you can go on board and have a look. But the lettering at the back was terrible. They repainted it in 2005 with what I thought was completely the wrong kind of letter. And rather amazingly, I persuaded the people who look after Victory that it would be a good idea to put something more appropriate. Well, with John Morgan and his colleagues, we managed to produce something, and there it is. One last type of mine. This is a type which is not quite as fat as the Fat I've shown you already. I'm very fond of it. Its canon, by the way, is about 48 points, so it's quite a big type. And that's the original specimen of 1819. But it was recast. Literally, you could do this in the 1930s. This was for a firm called the Kerwen Press, and they had it cast in type metal from these old mattresses, beautifully done, by the way. and there is one font of the original metal type which does survive, belongs to a friend of mine. Well, he's not going to let you play with it, but wouldn't it be nice if you could have a version? I thought so. So that's what I made. It may not be perfect, but there it is, and it can be used. And so I made, as you see, a Roman and an italic. The capitals, I think, are particularly fine. There they are. And so that's the end of my type making. And I will say that that's the end of this introduction. I hope you enjoy the rest of the course too.